Laura, and I am the Nerdy Needle. I am so glad you decided to join me here on my FlossTube channel today. Before I forget, please don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe to this video. I would really appreciate it. Today's video is the third video in my series that I'm calling Introduction to Cross Stitch 101, 102, and 103. In Cross Stitch 101, I'm showing how to complete one of these Mill Hill buttons and beads kits that is stitched on perforated paper. These are great little kits. They're very cute. They're really fun to stitch, and they don't look like a beginning cross stitch project. But with some guidance from me, I think that it's completely feasible for any beginner to complete one of these kits. And that's what this video is all about. In this video, I'm going to walk you through all of the techniques you need to be able to complete the actual, just the cross stitching part. For experienced stitchers, this is a video I wish I had when I came back to cross stitching about 8 or 9 years ago. I learned how to cross stitch back in high school and completely self-taught. And then when I returned to it some years ago, I discovered FlossTube and I learned a bunch of techniques from FlossTube, but they were kind of scattered sporadically through my viewing. And I would just happen upon like a nifty technique and I'd be like, yay, I can use that. But I wish that I had them all in one place. And so that's what this video is. It's just short video snippets showing many, many commonly used techniques. There's timestamps in the description box below for easy reference for all of them. And I think that this is going to be useful for experienced stitchers also. The techniques that I'm showing is like from the very beginning. So how to prepare your floss, how to start and end your threads, how to do one-handed and two-handed stitching, how to troubleshoot problems, and why I'm showing you a specific way of stitching and how that leads to a prettier end project. So what are the things that you need to pay attention to get prettier stitches, which lead to a prettier project in the end. So the last thing I want to say is that this is how I stitch. These are the techniques that I use. I don't think that there's really any one right way to do cross stitch. Cross stitch is all about the journey, and the journey is different for each stitcher. There's a lot of overlaps, but there's also a lot of individual preferences, and that's how it should be. So what's important in your stitching is that it brings you joy. The process of it brings you joy, not just the project that you display at the end. It has to be during the process of stitching itself that you find enjoyment. And so whatever way that you stitch is the right way for you to stitch if it brings you joy. If something is annoying you or it just doesn't seem to work for you, then that's not a technique that is for you. What this video is really, it's like giving you a buffet of options, and you can pick and choose the things that work for you. And some of it won't, but you know, that's okay. So don't think that this is what I'm showing you is the right way to stitch, because it's not. I used to do a whole bunch of long distance backpacking, and one of the things that we would say on the trail is hike your own hike. However you do it is the right way for you. And so I'm going to transfer that to stitching and stitch your own stitch. And what works for you is what works for you. And if it brings you joy and pleasure, then that's the right way for you to stitch. But I hope that what I'm showing you here today is going to open some doors for you, both for beginning stitchers and for more experienced stitchers, to have more options to reach for, to have more techniques that you can utilize to address different issues that you run into in your own stitching. So that's really the whole idea behind all of this. So here we go, from the very beginning, how to do cross stitch. I hope you find this helpful. So let's take a look at what floss looks like. Here's a full strand of floss. And if you kind of poke at the ends, you'll see that there's multiple strands that are in this one big bundle. And there's 8 strands in here. When you go to stitch, you're going to be stitching with one. Most often you're going to stitch with 2 strands, and every once in a while you'll see 3 strands. And that just gives you different amounts of coverage on the project in that area of the stitching, and it can give you a little bit of a 3-dimensional effect depending on how many strands of floss you're stitching with. To figure out how many you need, you look on your key, and that tells you how many strands you need. I'm just starting this project, my Playful Penguins. So what I'm doing is I'm looking in the upper left corner of my pattern, and I'm finding all of the colors that I'm going to run into in that area as I begin stitching. And I'm going to prep several colors all at once so that my needles are threaded, and then I just have to reach for them and I can start stitching immediately. So this is how you pull floss off of one of these organizers. So I need this up arrow color, this light blue. And the way that you pull a single strand of floss is you use a needle and you kind of hook it into one strand. I use my thumb right on that foam bit to hold the rest in place so it doesn't pop out from between those pieces of foam. And you pop one strand off of that peg, and then you just start pulling up. And you'll see that the tails kind of all pull up as you're pulling out the floss, but then they relax out, and they don't get tangled. And that's why I really like braiding the tails, because it really helps prevent a lot of tangles. So now here's my one strand of floss. When to thread this on a needle, I'm going to fold it in half and thread both ends through the eye of the needle. But before I do that, I'm going to straighten my floss. So if you look at it right now, you'll see that it's not horrible, but it's pretty kinked. It's pretty, it's not very straight. So what I do is I have a sponge. That's what the sponge is for. This is kind of soggy. You can hear that it's pretty darn wet. I just lay across the, I lay the floss across the sponge, kind of hold it down, and then I just pull it through. And I will actually do this several times. I kind of have a feel for when it glides more easily through the sponge, I know that my floss is nice and damp. And now you can see how much more straight it is. And that's what you want. This leads to prettier stitches and way less little slip knots that you sometimes get as you're stitching. Sometimes the floss just kind of loops back on itself and puts a little slip knot in your work. Everybody gets those, but if you straighten your floss, you're going to get them much, much, much less frequently. And the quality of your stitches will also be better. So this is a brilliant little idea. I used to use floss conditioners and stuff like that, but this is so much better. So now that my floss is damp, I just grab the 2 ends, kind of even them up. Now you want your ends nice and damp. You can lick your floss, or you can just use your damp sponge, kind of push it in there and get it really nice and soggy. If you lick it, you want to use your teeth and your tongue to kind of flatten it so it goes through the eye of the needle more easily, or you can just run it between your fingernail and your finger to get it a bit more flat. Now to thread a needle, don't try to thread like this. You want to thread towards you so you can see it coming through the needle. And these tapestry needles have huge eyes, so there's a good chance that you're just going to be able to thread without needing a needle threader. So once I have this needle threaded, I'm just going to park it on its corresponding color. And then I have 2 more colors to do. So again, you just hook in, pull, straighten. I learned this from another floss tuber, and it's just a genius idea. Now, sometimes when I straighten it, I just leave the floss folded in half as it came off the floss organizer. But before I thread the needle, I always open this up because I don't want the floss to be twisted around itself. So I always open it up and then I thread the needle. Get it damp. And then come on through the eye. If you can't get it, some tricks, these needles, the eyes of the needle, they're punched out. So these aren't poured like this when it was, the steel isn't just poured into a little mold. They actually punch the hole out. And so the needles are asymmetrical. One side is usually easier to thread than another. So if I can't get a needle to thread, one of the first things I'll do is I'll just spin it around to the other side and try from there. Another trick is to just snip a bit off and get a nice clean ends. Get it nice and damp. Kind of flatten it. And you can usually get it. This is my least favorite thing to do in stitching. And so that's why I came up with this way of stitching where you don't have to thread needles as often. You just leave your floss on your needles because then you don't have to do this as often. On this one, I'm going to show you how to use a needle threader. So you're going to just pull your color, straighten it, make sure you open it up so there's no twists in it. Then you fold it in half. And you're going to use that loop. So I use these Loran needle threaders because they stick to a magnet, which is really handy. It's the only one I've found that will do that. You use the smaller hook and you hook the needle on that little bit on the back, this little thing that sticks up on the back, and then you just hook the loop, square up your ends, and that's it. And your needle is threaded. The technique that I just showed you works with even numbers of strands of floss. So if you pull one strand of floss and thread the ends through a needle, you'll end up stitching with 2 strands. If you pull 2 strands of floss and thread the ends through a needle, you'll be stitching with 4 strands. If you need odd numbers of strands, so 1 or 3, for one strand, you'll pull 1 strand of floss, cut it in half, thread both pieces through a needle, stash one on your organizer, and stitch with the other one. For 3 strands of floss, you're going to pull 3 strands, but you're going to pull them one at a time. If you pull more than 1 strand off of that organizer at a time, you end up with a massive knot. So pull them one at a time, line them up, cut them in half, thread both batches of 3 through needles, stash one, and stitch with the other. I'm going to show you how to start stitching in the upper left corner, going left to right and top to bottom, stitching mostly in rows and following individual colors where they lead. Crossing the X the way I'll show you will give you prettier, more uniform stitches, which will make your finished project prettier. In Intro to Cross Stitch 102, I'll show you how to start in any corner and stitch rows or columns, whichever you prefer, and still get the same pretty results that you'll get starting in the upper left. So here's my paper, and I've identified my first stitch, which is right there. So this is the upper left corner. On that first stitch, I'm going to come up in the upper left corner of the stitch. I'm going to go down in the upper right corner. I'm not going to pull through. I'm going to flip over to the back side and hook the needle through the loop on the back and pull it tight. Now, tight in cross stitch means you just seat the stitch. You're not jerking, you're not pulling on anything. It's more seating the stitch, not pulling the stitch, but pulling is easier to say. Then you do your second leg. And I have a bunch of these, of this color in this area. So this is how you cross stitch. When I started stitching this project, the French horn pattern, the very top row of stitches in gold used 3 strands of floss. Well, you can't use the loop method to start 3 strands of floss, and when I was starting the pattern, there were no other stitches there to anchor the tail under using the buried tail method, which is what you need to start 3 strands of floss. So what I did was I skipped that first row and started stitching the rows below it so that I would have threads on the back to bury the tail for the gold floss that uses 3 strands. So now I'm going back and adding that row of stitches at the very top. So the one-handed method of stitching is pretty straightforward. You just hold your paper in your non-dominant hand and you just poke and pull back and forth. This is a perfectly fine way to stitch. A lot of people stitch this way. I sometimes just get bored of stitching two-handed, or if I just have a few stitches to place, then I'll just poke and pull it. On this perforated paper, because these holes are so big, if you don't grab the needle, it just falls out of the hole. So what I've been doing is I'll just place my index finger right against that needle to kind of push it against the paper so it doesn't fall out. But that's really the only trick to poke and pull on perforated paper. There is 2 ways that you can make your cross in your stitching. The first way is to complete each individual stitch, doing both legs before moving on to the next stitch. This is called the English cross, when you complete each individual stitch and then you move on to the next stitch. So this is a one-way process. You start at point A and you stitch to point B and you arrived at point B and that's it. Whereas the other way is called the Danish cross, and in the Danish cross what you do is you complete just the first leg of each stitch and then you turn around and complete the second leg. So this is a round trip. So you start at point A, you go to point B, and then you turn around and come back to point A. Which one you choose to do depends on the stitching that you are doing, or what that particular color that you're stitching is doing. For example, these big runs of this burgundy over here, I stitched all of this using the Danish, so the round trip, so over and back, just going row by row. Over here with this lighter green and this darker green, since it continues on across these skipped stitches, I didn't want to do a round trip with this light green, skipping and then going over here and then coming back, because then I have to skip this section twice. So I just did individual stitches. So I did English, skipped this bit, and then I switched back to doing Danish because there wasn't so much to skip over here. It just depends. Both of them look exactly the same. There is absolutely no difference. You cannot tell if you've stitched it English or Danish. There is no difference between the two. It's just the one that you choose kind of depends on what the color is doing. On this pattern of a Christmas French horn, I used the Danish cross on the dark blue, so round trip there and back, and English cross on the golden yellow horn, stitching one way as it curves around. I am now running out of floss, so I need to end this thread. And there's only one way that you can end thread on perforated paper, and that's by burying the tail. So you just run your needle under some stitches on the back and pull through. If you want, you can loop it around and really secure it, but honestly what I just did is probably plenty. And then you just snip off your floss. So you want to snip off as close to the paper as you can. If you bury your tail thoroughly like that, it's not going to come out. And you don't want little bits of floss just sticking up on the back, because that sometimes gets pulled through to the front of the project, and then you get this random bit of fuzz there that you really don't want there. So you can safely cut very close to the paper. Having a good pair of embroidery scissors is useful for that. I need to start a piece of floss that no longer has the loop on it. I had to stitch this somewhere else and then I ended it, and now I need to start this because there's plenty of floss to use. So I'm just going to use the buried tail method. So it's the same idea as the way that you end threads. So I have about 8 stitches here that I need to skip. I'll count it when I figure it out, but when I actually go to put the stitch. But to figure out about where I need to bury my tail, I put the needle through just so that I have a reference that I need to bury in here. So I just run under some stitches. And then this is pretty loosely held, so you kind of pull it in and then you need to use your finger to hold it. So I hand hold this. I poke and pull stitch the first few stitches when I start this way, because otherwise it's too easy to pull that tail out. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And so I'll just do the first few stitches, and then it'll be secure. So first 2 legs of the stitch, and now that's all secure, and I have my buried tail right there. I have a floss that I need to get started, but it doesn't have a loop on it, so I can't use the loop start. I could use the buried tail method, but there's a third way to start, and I'm going to show you how that works. It's called the buried waist knot method. So I'm going to be stitching all the way across this section. It's a slightly modified process on perforated paper compared to fabric. On fabric, you actually would put a knot. On paper, you're not going to put a knot. That's why I've renamed it the buried waist knot method, N-O-T-K-N-O-T, because I don't want you to put a knot on paper because it's too hard to cut off. So you come in on the several stitches away from where you're actually going to start stitching. So it has to be in the same row and several stitches away. And then you come up where you need to start your stitches, and you're holding on to this little tail. And you start placing your stitches, and what you're going to do is catch the thread on the back under your stitches. So you're using the same thread to bury its tail as the one you're stitching with. So it's basically burying itself. You just got to sweep up a little bit and make sure that you catch the floss under the stitches. You don't need to do as long of a run of stitches as I'm doing here. Probably 3 or 4 is plenty to get it started, but I just decided to do the whole run of stitches. So now that I've gotten to the place where this floss is, I actually need that hole now. So I'm just going to turn it over. You can see how nicely it buried its own tail. You're going to pull this to the front or to the back, and then that will get snipped off. I'm just going to do a few more. Just going to finish catching that since I still have one more stitch to do. And start heading back. So now all I have left to do is snip off that little bit of fuzz. And I've started my floss by burying its own tail. If you were doing this on fabric, you would do the same thing, but you can hold it. Sometimes I'll hold it, but fabric is more floppy and it's harder to hold than on paper. On paper, it's really easy to hold. So if you were doing this on fabric, you could put a knot on the thread that went down there, stitch over the top of it, and when you get to it, you just cut that knot off and pull it to the back and finish like I just showed you. So this is the buried waist knot method, which is the buried waist knot method if you're stitching on perforated paper. I'm going to show you how to stitch two-handed. Two-handed stitching, it takes advantage of our spatial awareness of our bodies, especially with our hands and our fingers. So you can touch your two index fingers together like that with your eyes closed without any trouble. You can put your one finger underneath a table and you can point to exactly where that finger is on the top, even though you can't see your finger. That's the thing that two-handed stitching takes advantage of, the spatial awareness we have of our bodies. You need to set up your paper and your magnets so that the row of stitching that you're going to do, which for me is right here, is right up against the edge of the paper. You don't want it out further because then the paper starts flexing more as you're pushing the needle through it. I have this middle magnet there, and you kind of have to play around where the best placement is for you. It's there because as you're pushing up against the paper, it flexes a little bit. Like over here, you can kind of see it as I'm gently poking it. The paper flexes, and I like it better when it's nice and firm, so that magnet keeps the paper nice and stiff, and it flexes much less. The height of your table is important. You want to make this so that it's reasonably ergonomic. You're not going to end up with a sore back or a sore neck. For me, the ideal height is for my bottom arm to rest on my thigh, and then all I have to do is just move my hand to manipulate the needle. So play around with the height to figure out what works for you. Essentially, all it is passing the needle back and forth between your two hands. This is quite easy on perforated paper because you not only have the spatial awareness of your fingers to help guide you, but you can see the glint of the needle through the paper. And that's what makes it really quite straightforward. These holes are really big compared to how big they are on fabric. And so this makes it quite straightforward to stitch two-handed. So all you do is you pass the needle back and forth between your hands. What I do is I put my index finger right next to the hole, and the way that I hold my needle, I have my index finger right next to the tip of the hole, because this is the motion that I'm doing. And since as my two index fingers are trying to find each other, the needle is right there and the hole is right there. So that's how I use the spatial awareness of my hands to be able to guide the needle. It's less important on the paper because you have the visual glint of the needle that you can also rely on. On fabric, stitching two-handed is a little bit more difficult because you can't see through the holes like you can on paper. So this finger method becomes a lot more important because that's really what guides your needle into that hole. And on fabric, what you end up doing is you have to poke around a little bit to find that hole, because sometimes you just nail it exactly right, but sometimes you have to poke around a little bit. I mean, even with paper, I have to poke around a little bit, but your index finger just guides it straight to the hole. And I just find this quite enjoyable to stitch this way, because you can really get into a really nice rhythm. And you can progress quite quickly, and I like that because I like seeing progress, and I like having things changing in my stitching, being able to switch to a different color or a different part of the project. It just keeps it more interesting for me. So I'm actually stitching a little bit slower than I usually do because I can't get my head quite over my stitching because of the camera, but you can see that you can really stitch quite quickly with this method. So that is two-handed stitching, and you can do it, it doesn't matter what kind of cross you're making, whether it's English or Danish, it works the same way each time, or for each version. I have two suggestions for using the GoodReader app with your stitching. The first one is to mark all of your beads with a color that's different than what you're going to use for marking off your stitches. So you can see my beads are in blue and my completed stitches are in yellow. That makes navigating the chart a lot easier. It makes getting all of those skipped stitches land in the right place. So it just makes life a lot easier. The second one has to do with accessing the menu on the right that you constantly need, because that's where the freehand tool is. So currently, if I tap the screen, I have to tap the main menu, select all, and then the menu comes up on the right, and then I can use my freehand tool or the line tool or whatever I need. That's a lot of clicking or a lot of tapping. So if you click on the little pushpin icon at the top of that menu and it turns into an X, that keeps that menu toggled so that as soon as you tap the screen, that menu appears. So you don't have those 3 taps, you just have one, and that immediately gets your menu up. So a couple of tricks for using GoodReader. So I was too busy talking to you about how to stitch two-handed, and I didn't realize that I don't want a stitch there because there's going to be a bead there. So I need to frog all of this back to there. So with frogging, the trick is you don't want to frog mad. If you're doing this when you're angry because you made a mistake, you're gonna start damaging things. So I just use a needle and just pull the floss, and I kind of keep an eye on it. This perforated paper, because it's because it doesn't really, the holes are so big, it doesn't really rub the floss very much as you're stitching. So if I was frogging all of this on fabric, I doubt that I'd be able to restitch because the floss would just fray. But on this perforated paper, I suspect, I'll check it when I get there, but I suspect that I'll just be able to restitch this. On fabric, I would probably just cut off right there because I'd know that it's going to get too frayed. But so I would just cut it short so that I don't have to have so much floss going through. It's just easier. But since this is on this perforated paper, it makes it so I can probably get away with restitching it. And making mistakes is part of cross stitch. Even the most expert stitchers who've been stitching for like 50, 60 years, they still make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. You miscount, you miss something on the chart, whatever. So looking at the floss, it looks fine. It's not frayed at all. So the place to compare fray is like on the ends of your floss. That's when you can start seeing what fraying floss looks like. This looks perfectly fine. By the way, you can get a cool little frogging tool like this that has a little, it's just cute. I like this thing. But you don't, I mean, that's just decorative for fun. You don't really need that. So now that I have frogged those stitches, I'm going to straighten the floss and then let it, I just kind of lay it on top of the sponge just to get it damp. And then I obviously am going to let this dry before I start stitching it, because you don't want to stitch on paper with damp floss. You don't want to stitch with damp floss on fabric either. It feels horrible. It just catches like crazy when you're pulling through with damp floss. So you can totally tell that it's still damp. But anyways, that's how you frog. You just use your needle and just undo the stitches you need to, and then you look at the floss and see if you can restitch it or not. And if it's not frayed, you can just restitch it. As I've been stitching, I've noticed that my floss has gotten twisted on itself. It happens because as the floss goes up and down through the paper, you just put a little bit of a twist on the needle each time, and so it just starts twisting around itself. This is something that you want to try to avoid. The more you can get your stitches to lay parallel like this, the prettier your stitches will be. If they're laying on top of each other like that, your two strands of floss, you're not going to get as pretty a stitch as if they're laying nice and parallel. So this happens to everyone. So the solution for it is to just hold up your floss and let your needle hang. I'll actually open it up like that, and then I'll run my finger along the length of the floss to take the twists out. But if you're stitching two-handed, you just drop your needle and let it just unwind on its own, and that gets a bunch of the twist out. So it doesn't have to be perfect, but you do want to try to get your strands to not be twisted on themselves. The other thing that you're going to notice with your floss is as you stitch, by the time you get to the end of a length of floss, your two ends are no longer going to be flush with each other. Even though you squared them up at the beginning, they're going to end up about like that. And that happens to everyone. I actually for a while tried to avoid it, but it's essentially next to impossible to avoid this happening. And it really doesn't matter. It just happens because you're stitching at angles. And so one strand of floss has to go a little bit further each time you stitch. And so you end up with things kind of off kilter like that. But it doesn't matter one bit. I have a tail that I need to bury right here, but it's too short to be able to thread on a needle and to pull it through with a needle. So I'm going to use a different technique. It's called the Lasso method. And what you need is a short piece of floss threaded on a needle with a loop. So like a loop start. And then you just take this needle and thread it through where you want to bury these stitches. Where you want to bury this tail, I mean. Okay, so now you pull the needle through and you leave the loop on the other side, so don't pull it through all the way. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take this short little tail and you're going to hook it into this loop. Now you want to be careful, and when you go to put this in, you don't want to pull the tail in all the way to the neck of the loop, because then it doesn't have much to grab into. You want to get this choked up a little bit so that you're maybe about a third of the way up in the loop. So you kind of have to poke at it a little bit so that it's not all the way up there. And then once you kind of have it in place, you just carefully pull it, and now your tail is buried. So that's called the lasso method for burying tails that are too short to use a needle with. So I was stitching this yellow color and I decided that I was just going to get every single one of the stitches, and this is the end of the column for this yellow. Then I had the problem that I need to bury its tail, but there's not a whole, there's basically just that stitch to bury it with, and that's not really enough. So what I decided to do was I just brought my needle up to the front and took it to the back. But I did this completely out of the way of all of the stitching that I'm going to do. The final row of stitching on here, or the column, is going to be right there. So this section right here will never get stitched. So my plan is to continue stitching, and then when I get to this row, I'll just stitch over that tail, so the tail will be buried, and then I can pull this anchored tail out and then just cut it off flush like I usually do. So this is a good strategy for temporarily anchoring a floss until the rest of your stitching gets there, and then you can stitch over it and you can anchor it that way. I misplaced a stitch, and one of the nice things about stitching on this perforated paper is that it's really easy to back out of a stitch. So what you need to do is just put a bit of tension on the floss, so you pull it into its corner so that you have the maximum space open on the stitch. Same thing when coming down from the top, you just put some tension on it so that the hole is nice and clean and you don't accidentally split the thread. So backing out of a stitch is really easy with perforated paper. It's significantly more risky on fabric, especially on Aida. You can try it, but I'd say it works a little bit over half the time, and the other half of the time you just make a mess and you end up having to frog stuff. So, but on this perforated paper, backing out of a hole is really easy, and then you don't have to unthread your needle. Sometimes when you're stitching along, you'll notice that as you're pulling your thread through the holes, all of a sudden it comes up a little bit shorter than what you think it should. And what often is the case is on the back, your thread has looped around itself and made a little slip knot. So they look like this. And it's not a big deal if you get them. So you can pull on different parts of this. If you pull on the loop, sometimes that helps. Sometimes you have to loosen the actual knot at the neck of it. And sometimes you can just pull it and it'll come out. You just kind of get a feel for knowing how to get rid of a slip knot just from experience. Having good magnification on when you're dealing with the slip knot so you can really see what the thread is doing is really, really helpful. This is a magnified view of a slip knot on the back of a project that I recently finished. Sometimes you just don't catch them and you'll get this little slip knot on the back. It's usually not a big problem and you can just leave them. Using a damp sponge to straighten your floss reduces the number of these down to next to nothing. This is the only one I could find on a project that's, I think, around 18,000 stitches. I've stitched all the way across now, and I noticed something, that my two margins are not of equal size. This side is a little bit wider than this side. So what to do about this? Now, the last thing I want to do is to rip out a bunch of stitching. Probably what happened is somewhere in here I miscounted. I've checked all of this. There's no mistakes there, so it's probably in here somewhere, and I certainly don't want to pull all of those stitches. So I pulled out the frame, and I'm going to check it inside the frame and see if I can just shift the paper over so that the margins become equal. But it doesn't look like I can do that. And since this is going to be solidly stitched all the way on that right edge, I think, and the same thing on the left edge, I think it's going to be visible that my two edges are not symmetrical. I will certainly notice it, and it's probably going to annoy me. So I looked at my pattern, and it's going to be really easy to just add an extra stitch on this edge So just plunk in an extra stitch, and now I'm symmetrical. So on this edge, I'm just going to add one stitch of whatever color I was on this right margin. I'll just add an extra stitch so that it centers correctly in the frame. I made a counting mistake somewhere, but that's a pretty easy fix. So you're going to make counting mistakes. Everyone does. Before you start ripping out stitches, you want to look to see if you can salvage what you have. I actually have made this mistake several times in the past where I've miscounted at the beginning of a project, and then I just fudge in an extra row or column to get everything to line up correctly. And honestly, I couldn't even tell you which projects those were on because you can't tell. So there's a lot of ways that you can salvage mistakes without having to undo a bunch of work. On large blocks of color like this, where you have just the same color and with some random skips in it for other colors or for beads, one of the things I'll do is I look on the chart and I use these skipped spots as references to help me on the current row that I'm stitching. So on this one, instead of remembering that I need to have, I don't even know, what is that, 9 stitches, I just saw on my chart that on this row I need to go 2 past that skipped stitch right there. So that's the 2 holes, the 2 stitches past it, and then I skip. So I use those as references. On this next one, I know that I just, well, this one is just 2, but on longer stretches of stitching, where you don't want to have to like count and then somebody's talking to you and you forget how many it was, you can just use the references of other colors around it to help you figure out how many stitches you need to put. The main reason why I make counting mistakes is because I don't cross off my stitches often enough. When I get in the habit of crossing my stitches off regularly, then I make a lot fewer mistakes. So I would recommend that as you're stitching along that you mark off your chart on a regular basis, probably more often than you think you should. If you're wondering about the GoodReader app that I'm talking about, I described that in video number 2, how you can digitize a paper chart and how you can use the GoodReader app to mark off your stitches. Sometimes when you're stitching, your needle and thread will bring a bit of fuzz from the back to the front of the project. So there's a bit of it right there. And there's this really nifty tool. It's called a Snag Nab It. It's got a really sharp point and then this rough end that grabs onto any little bits of fuzz and it just forces it to the back of the project. This also works for if you have a stitch that looks a little bit loose. I've looked through mine. I don't have any currently, but if you have a stitch that's just seated a little bit loosely, you can use this to push through next to that stitch, and then it'll tighten up the stitch so that it looks even with the rest. So all you do is you just take the pointy end and you pull it through and your fuzz is gone. So this is a great little tool. It's called the Snag Nab It. If you don't need it as many times, or you don't need it very often on stitching on perforated paper, but when you're stitching on fabric, especially Aida, it really is great because you do get those little bits of fuzz coming up to the front, and this takes care of it very easily and very quickly. So it's the Snag Nab It. The key to making pretty stitches that will lead to a beautiful finished project is to make your stitches as uniform as possible. So my first rule of cross stitch says to cross your X the same way each time. This is a close-up of one of my current projects, and you can see that each stitch is crossed the same way, making my stitches more uniform. Because we are stitching our project starting in the upper left corner and we're stitching rows from top to bottom, the first leg of each stitch needs to be from bottom left to top right, while the second leg is bottom right to top left. To make prettier stitches, it's important to do this 100% of the time. I've carried a brightly colored thread between two stitches on my perforated paper, and you can see that the carried thread is visible through the holes. Carrying thread on the back of a project from one area to another is perfectly fine if the section with the carried thread will be fully stitched in other colors. But if the area with the carried thread will remain unstitched, that carried thread will show through the holes in the perforated paper, which really isn't all that pretty and should be avoided. So my second rule of cross stitch is avoid carrying thread behind areas that won't be stitched. This carried thread problem is true for stitching on fabric also. This is the product photo for a cross stitch kit where you can see the carried thread between the snowflakes, which I think kind of spoils the project. This individual stitch problem, which usually occurs when stitching stars or snowflakes like in this kit, can be solved using a pin stitch, which can only be done on fabric, so I'll show you that technique in Cross Stitch 102, part of the video series, which is all about stitching on Aida. Individual stitches needed for stars or snowflakes like here are pretty rare. Most of the time you have blocks of color separated by unstitched areas like the large and small trees on the right. To avoid carrying floss between the trees, you could end your thread and start a new one for the other tree, or you can tunnel your thread under the connecting green stitches between the two trees by burying the floss under those stitches on the back, just like when you use the buried tail method to end a thread, until you get to the new area where you can start stitching with that color. I don't have a good example of a tunneled carried thread on perforated paper. I've looked at my projects and I can't really find a good place where I can demonstrate that. But I can show it to you on a project I'm stitching on linen. And linen does have very similar issues as perforated paper in that it's a pretty loose weave, and you can see how floss just shows up through the holes. So you have to be really careful with carrying thread between areas on this. You got to avoid it, otherwise you're going to see red between the different sections. So we're going to take a look at the swan right here. What I did was I stitched the body, and then I stitched one wing, and then I buried the thread across to stitch the other. So let's look at what I did. When I stitched the swan, I stitched the body, then I stitched this wing, and then I carried my floss from over here to over here, but I wove the floss under this thread so that it wouldn't just be a big long carried thread. I carried it up here, did a couple of stitches up, and then I stitched this wing. So there's an example of how you can bury your floss to carry it from one area to another so that you're not risking that thread going over some areas that will remain unstitched. On sampler style stitching like this, this is a really important skill because there's so much open space on samplers that you have to learn that tunneled technique to avoid carrying thread across open regions. The same thing applies on perforated paper if you run into this. I just don't have a good example of it right now, but this works. My third rule for prettier stitches, it has to do with your general stitching direction. So we're starting our projects in the upper left corner, and we're making our crosses by going bottom left to top right and then bottom right to top left. That's the order of the legs in our stitches. So with those two things, with starting on the upper leg and the way we make our cross, you're going to get prettier stitches if you stitch left to right and top to bottom. Now, the top to bottom is the really important part of this. The left to right is useful, but you can go right to left. If you go right to left, your stitches will still be as pretty as when you go left to right. you're just going to use more floss. But if you're going top to bottom versus bottom to top, when you go from top down, you're going to get prettier stitches than when you come up, when you go from the bottom up. I'll explain why that is at the end of the video in the last section of this video. So let's talk about these petals right here. They have the same color in each one of them. So if you stitch down and carried across, which is fine because you're going to cover the carried floss with other colors, but if you stitch up here, the stitches that you stitch down are going to be more uniform and more pretty than the ones that you stitch up. So the solution for this is to stitch down and either end your thread and start it again, or you stitch down, tunnel up, stitch down, tunnel up, stitch down, and so on. And then you're going to get uniform stitches on each of those petals. So this is the third rule that for prettier stitches in cross stitch is whenever possible, you want to stitch left to right and especially top to bottom. So my fourth and final rule for prettier stitches in cross stitch is that you want to avoid surrounding a stitch that still has to be placed. So I need to put a stitch in the middle there, and I need to put one right there. This is what you want to avoid as much as you can. You want to put that stitch there before you finish the final side of all the stitches that will surround that. Now, perforated paper is very forgiving with regard to this. You can get away with circling around a stitch that you have to put later, and it will work just fine. But when we switch to stitching on fabric, on Aida, this is not something that you want to do. You want to put the stitch when one side is still open, and it's not completely surrounded. So while you're stitching on your perforated paper project, I would recommend keeping an eye on this and trying to avoid this situation as much as possible. It doesn't matter on the paper if you do it, but if you're getting ready to transition over to stitching on fabric, it's a good skill to learn here where it doesn't really matter. I mean, even in my own stitching, this is that Playful Penguins project that I'm working on, and you can see that I've got plenty of these holes that still need to be stitched, and some of them are like completely surrounded by other stitches. I would never do this on Aida. If I was stitching on Aida, I would use a slightly different technique, and I would fill in these stitches as I was stitching the row. It's too hard to do that technique on this perforated paper. Things just flop around too much. So I'll show you that when we switch over to stitching on Aida. So right now it doesn't matter, but just develop the habit of avoiding doing this as much as possible. I actually did this on purpose in my own stitching to have it as an illustration for you. So the fourth rule in cross stitch for prettier stitches is to avoid surrounding a stitch that still needs to be placed. My rule number 3 for prettier stitches says that you should stitch from left to right and top to bottom whenever possible as you move through your project. And I want to show you why that is. So this is 6 count fabric. The perforated paper in the Mill Hill projects is 14 count. So these squares are over twice as big as on the perforated paper, and it's really useful to use because you can really see what's going on. So I've stitched the same pattern 3 times. The first time I stitched top down like I'm supposed to. So I went bottom left, top right, bottom left, top right, and then I went down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, and so on. So every single time I switched, I went down and then I went up, and then I went down and then I went up, every single time, all the way down. If you look in this center hole right here, you can see that the 4 threads that use up that hole, that are in that hole, are each happily playing with each other. Each one gets 25% of the hole, and if you look closely, you can even see the white paper through the hole. So each thread is pulled into its corner of the hole, and that leaves plenty of room for the other 3 legs that go into that hole. So everybody in this group of 4 is playing nicely with each other. Each time the floss crosses the fabric, it changes direction. This causes the floss to get pulled into its corner of the hole. In the block of 4 stitches, you can see how each thread in the center hole only takes 25% of the hole. On this one, what I did was I stitched from bottom up. So I started, and I did the crosses the same way that we do. So bottom left, top right, top left. And then here is one of our problems, but we also have a problem here. So if you see that I came up and then down and then up and then kind of over to get my next stitch. And if you compare what's going on in that middle hole compared to here, this thread right here is taking a little bit more of the hole than its 25% share should be. So continuing on, I finished here and then I went up again. So I came up and then I went up again. And you can see that this thread right here is a little bit longer when you compare it to its equivalent over here, because the thread is being pulled up. Here, the thread, because you get that thread direction change, the thread gets pulled down, so the thread gets pulled into its corner. Here, it's getting pulled up, so it ends up kind of being forced to take more than its share of the hole. Same thing here, the thread is coming in from below and is continuing in the same direction. You don't have a thread direction change there. You do here because you came down and then up and then down and then up. Here it was up, up. So no thread direction change. And you can see that this thread is also taking a little bit more of its hole than it should. That one's fine, but this one also is elongated. It's taking more than its share. Same thing with this one. So each one of these little elongated legs of a stitch adds some irregularity into your stitching. You can see how many of these stitches have elongated legs marked with red arrows. This occurs when there is no thread direction change when the floss crosses the fabric. In the block of 4 stitches, you can see how one thread is taking more than its share of the hole because it didn't have a thread direction change, causing it to be elongated. If you have this occur every once in a while, it's going to disappear amongst all the other correctly stitched stitches. And I will stitch up here and there when I need to. But if you stitch like whole columns going up, now you're going to introduce this irregularity every time you move up a row, and you're just compounding this issue of this elongated leg, and you're introducing all of those irregular stitches into your pattern, and that's going to become visible. Not that you can actually point to it and say that, oh, elongated legs. If you compare a project stitch like this compared to one stitch like this is going to be stunningly beautiful. This is going to be pretty. And I know this from my own work because I used to do this and I'd make pretty projects. But once I figured this out with help from my fellow floss tubers, my projects went from pretty to stunning. And it's not because I'm a phenomenal stitcher. It's just because I understand this rule that every time I cross the fabric, I need to change thread direction. This third stitch over here, I did the same thing. I stitched bottom up, but I changed how I started each stitch. So I just did these normal, and then as I came here, instead of coming into the bottom left hole, I went up to the top right hole. And so I'm going into the farther hole to start my stitch as opposed to the nearer hole. You can really see this here. So I came up here, you can see this leg is elongated, but this one isn't. And the reason for that is because instead of coming into that hole, I went into that one. So this got elongated, but then you get your thread direction change there, coming down. Now you get it from there to there. And then, so you basically cut your elongation problem in half, because this leg is no longer elongated. It's only this top one, this top corner that is. Same thing here. You can see that this leg is not elongated, so that corner, whereas this one is. So if you have to stitch up, which on occasion you will, because there's a couple of stitches that you missed or whatever, and you're going to need to plunk those in, the solution for it is really easy. To avoid half of this elongated stitch problem, when you travel up, you go into the further hole, and that cuts the stitch elongation problem in half. Here, each stitch was started in the upper right corner instead of the bottom left, eliminating the elongated stitch in the bottom left hole, so the number of elongated stitches has been cut in half. The stitch in the upper left hole remains elongated. So the bottom line is, when you're stitching, every time you cross the fabric, you want your thread direction to change so that the thread gets pulled into its corner of its hole, and so it shares the hole equally with all its friends. And now you've got very uniform stitches, whereas when you introduce this thread elongation problem, you start getting non-uniform stitches. They become irregular, and that's going to become visible as a less than stunning project when you're finished. When stitching in rows, it doesn't matter if you go left to right or right to left. You will get a thread direction change in each, so you don't have to worry about stitch elongation in rows, only columns. If you stitch right to left, you will use more floss, and if you do it a lot in a section, your fabric may become a bit distorted from the uneven pull of thread on the back of each stitch. This is not an issue on perforated paper. If you prefer to stitch right to left, you'll need to change how you cross the X so that you'll get a thread direction change every time you cross the fabric. I'll explain how to do this in Cross Stitch 102. Unfortunately, the instructions for every single project I've ever seen tells you to start stitching at the center of the project. This means that the entire upper half of the project is going to be full of irregular stitches with elongated legs because you're forced to stitch up. It's much better to start in the upper left corner where you can consistently stitch down and avoid this problem. The stitch elongation problem is primarily a concern when you have large blocks of stitching, such as in this full coverage piece. There are lots of stitches around to compare to each other, so it's important that the stitches be as uniform as possible, so stitch elongation should be avoided. This project is around 48,000 stitches, and my guess is that I have less than 100 stitches in it where a stitch was elongated from stitching up. I stitched the entire piece row by row, top to bottom, so I only had to stitch up when I missed a stitch in a row. I'll show you how I stitch projects like this in Intro to Cross Stitch 102. In 102, I'll also show you how you can start in any corner and stitch rows or columns and get consistently pretty stitches, just like I'm showing you with this upper left corner start, stitching rows. In this sampler, I avoided stitch elongation in the large motifs like the rabbit and unicorn, but in the bits that don't have blocks of stitching, like the branch and the rabbit's paw, the unicorn's horn and tail, or the small letters, I did stitch up on some of it, going into the top hole whenever I did. Trying to stitch down on each motif would be a counting nightmare. This is stitched on linen, so I have to count the individual linen threads in the fabric to find my place, and it's easy to miscount, which I do fairly often. In areas where there aren't many stitches to compare to each other, in my opinion, any stitch irregularity won't be noticeable, and stitching up in some bits saves me from having to do lots of extra counting, make lots of extra mistakes, and do a bunch of extra frogging. I do start stitching each motif in the upper left, so most of the stitches in each motif are still stitched down. I'll show you how I stitch projects like this in Intro to Cross Stitch 103. My rule number 4 for prettier stitches says that you should avoid surrounding a stitch that you still need to place. So avoid stitching the dark gray and then putting in the light gray. And I want to explain to you why that is. So you're going to come up in the bottom left hole. If you've already done the dark gray and you're trying to put the light gray, you're going to come up in the bottom left hole. This bottom left hole has 3 threads in it already, from 1 to 3 stitches that are already there. Coming up in a hole that has 3 threads in it is a little bit tricky. One of the problems is that there's some chance, because most of the hole is filled with floss, there's some chance that as you come up with your needle is going to pierce the 2 plies that make up each strand of floss. So you're going to pierce your thread. And that's something that you really don't want to be doing, because it just damages the floss and it leads to just not very pretty stitches. The other issue is going to be that either the thread that you bring up here, it's going to bully the other 3 threads in the hole and use up more than its 25% share of the hole, or it turns into a wallflower and it never gets its fair share. So either the stitch becomes a little too big or a little too small. Sometimes you get it just right and it'll be perfectly fine, but enough of the time you're going to get this stitch becoming irregular that it's worth avoiding this. Now on perforated paper, this really isn't much of an issue. The holes on perforated paper are really big, and also it's paper and not fabric. In fabric, you've got floss threads and fabric threads that are interacting with each other, and the holes are smaller on fabric also, but there's considerable friction between the fabric and the thread, much more so than with paper and thread. So on perforated paper, putting this middle stitch in after you've stitched all the way around it is really no big deal. But if you want to move on to stitching on fabric, learning to avoid doing that here when it doesn't really matter is a good idea. And because our goal is to get regular uniform stitches so that our finished product looks stunning and not just pretty. So the solution for avoiding this coming up in a hole with 3 threads, which is tricky to do, is to not completely surround the stitch. So stitch it like that and then place this middle stitch and then place these 3. Now you're coming up in a hole with 1 thread in it as opposed to 3, and that's not a problem. You're going down in a hole with 3 threads in it, but going down in a hole is much easier than coming up because you can use your eyes. Here, you're coming up from below, you can't see it. Here you can. So in general, it's easier to come up in a less occupied hole and go down in a more occupied hole than the reverse. You wouldn't want to make this stitch coming up here and going down there, because now you're coming up in a more occupied hole and going down in the less occupied hole, which is the opposite of what you should be doing. Once you've put this stitch in, then you place these 3 stitches in, and now the chances are that this is going to get its fair share of each hole and it's going to be a uniform stitch, as opposed to here where sometimes it's going to be too big or too small. So in general, the rule is it's better to come up in a less occupied hole and go down in a more occupied hole than the opposite. So that's a complete overview of all of the techniques that you need to be able to stitch one of these Mill Hills buttons and beads kits for doing all of the cross stitching. The next video will be significantly shorter because all it is showing you how to do the back stitching and some of the specialty stitches that occur in these Mill Hill buttons and beads kits, and then also how to do the beading for the project. At the end of next video, you'll have all of the techniques to completely finish your project, and then you can have your own your own buttons and beads projects to frame and display. So I hope you enjoyed what I had to show you. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope you have a good day.